There is a language spoken by the dead that the living can pronounce but cannot understand. The language is Etruscan. It was spoken for at least 700 years by the people who built the civilization that preceded Rome, the people who gave Rome its kings, its religious rituals, its architectural traditions, its gladiatorial games, and according to the Romans themselves, the very name of the city. The Etruscans were not a minor culture on the periphery of history. They were the dominant civilization of the Italian peninsula for centuries before Rome rose to power. Their cities stretched from the Po Valley in the north to Campania in the south. Their naval fleets controlled the Tyrrhenian Sea. Their art, their engineering, and their religion shaped the culture of the Roman Republic so profoundly that later Roman writers openly acknowledged the debt. "We are the pupils of the Etruscans," the Roman senator Cato the Elder said, and he was not exaggerating. The Etruscans left behind over 13,000 inscriptions. 13,000. That is not a small corpus. That is a substantial body of text. More inscriptions than survive for many well-understood ancient languages. The inscriptions are carved in stone, painted on pottery, incised on bronze mirrors, etched into gold jewelry, and written on clay tiles and linen wrappings. They are found across central Italy, in tombs, in temples, in sanctuaries, and in the ruins of cities that were thriving urban centres when Rome was still a village of mud huts on the banks of the Tiber. And here is the fact that makes the Etruscan language one of the strangest puzzles in the history of linguistics. We can read every single one of those 13,000 inscriptions. We can read them because the Etruscan alphabet is well understood. It was adapted from the Greek alphabet, and the sound values of the letters are known. We can pick up an Etruscan inscription, sound out the words, and pronounce them with reasonable confidence. We know what Etruscan sounded like. We can speak it aloud. We can read it off the page as fluently as a newsreader reads the evening bulletin. We just do not know what most of it means. The numbers are striking. Of the 13,000 Etruscan inscriptions, the vast majority, roughly 90%, are short funerary texts, names, patronymics, ages, and titles inscribed on tomb walls and sarcophagi. These are largely understood because the formulas they follow are repetitive, and because the names and titles can be cross-referenced with other sources. But the remaining 10%, the longer texts, the religious documents, the legal records, the ritual prescriptions that would reveal the inner workings of Etruscan thought, belief, and social organization, are only partially, imperfectly, and often disputably understood. We can pronounce the words, we can identify some vocabulary items, we can parse some grammatical structures, but we cannot read Etruscan in the way that we read Latin or Greek, with full comprehension of meaning, nuance, and intent. The language floats in a twilight zone between legibility and incomprehension, readable in form and opaque in content. By the end of tonight, you are going to understand why. You are going to learn what makes Etruscan so uniquely resistant to full understanding. Not because its script is unknown, not because its corpus is small, not because no effort has been expended, but because the language itself stands alone. Etruscan is a linguistic isolate, a language with no known relatives, no family tree, no cousins or siblings or descendants that could provide the comparative framework through which dead languages are normally understood. It is, in the landscape of the ancient Mediterranean, an orphan, a language that arrived from nowhere, connected to nothing, and left no descendants. And without relatives, a dead language is like a locked room with no windows. You can press your ear to the door and hear sounds, but you cannot see what is inside. Before we get started, if you find these mysteries as fascinating as we do, take a second to like the video or subscribe. It is a simple action, but it helps this channel reach more curious minds like yours. Now let us begin. The story of the Etruscan language begins with a people whose origins are themselves a mystery. One of the oldest unsolved questions in Mediterranean history. The Etruscans emerged in central Italy sometime during the first millennium before the Common Era, inhabiting the region that the Romans called Etruria, and that corresponds roughly to modern Tuscany, along with parts of Umbria and Lazio. By the 7th century before the Common Era, they had developed a network of prosperous city-states: Veii, Cerveteri, Tarquinia, Vulci, Chiusi, Volterra, Perugia, and others that constituted the most advanced urban civilization on the Italian peninsula. Their cities were planned, walled, and equipped with sophisticated drainage and water supply systems. Their houses were built of stone and timber, roofed with terracotta tiles, an Etruscan innovation that the Romans would later adopt. Their temples, while built of perishable materials, and therefore largely lost, were described by Roman architectural writers as elaborate structures with wide eaves, decorated facades, and terracotta sculptures that rivaled Greek work in their artistry. The Etruscans were also master metalworkers, producing bronze vessels, gold jewelry, and iron implements of extraordinary quality. The Etruscan technique of granulation, the soldering of tiny gold spheres onto a surface to create intricate decorative patterns, remains one of the finest metalworking achievements of the ancient world. Modern goldsmiths have struggled to replicate the precision and delicacy of the best Etruscan granulation work. The technique, like so many Etruscan technologies, was transmitted to the Romans and through them to the broader Mediterranean world, but the specific methods used by the Etruscan artisans who achieved the finest results have been lost. Another example of embodied craft knowledge that perished with its practitioners. The Etruscans also invented, or at least developed to a high degree of sophistication, the true arch, the vault, and the dome, architectural innovations that the Romans would later employ on a monumental scale in their aqueducts, bridges, and public buildings. The Roman sewer system, the Cloaca Maxima, was originally an Etruscan construction, built to drain the marshy area that would become the Roman Forum. The gladiatorial games that would become the defining spectacle of Roman culture were, according to ancient tradition, of Etruscan origin, derived from funeral rites in which armed combatants fought to honor the dead. The Roman toga, the garment that symbolized Roman citizenship, was adapted from an Etruscan original. The fasces, the bundle of rods and an axe that symbolized Roman magisterial authority and that gives us the modern word fascism, was an Etruscan symbol of power. The list of Roman cultural elements with Etruscan origins is so long and so comprehensive that some scholars have described early Roman civilization as essentially Etruscan civilization with Latin speech. This debt was openly acknowledged by the Romans themselves. The Etruscan influence was not a secret or a source of shame. It was a recognized historical fact, a fact that Roman writers discussed with a mixture of gratitude and condescension, acknowledging the Etruscans' cultural contributions while emphasizing that Rome had surpassed its teachers. The Romans did not destroy Etruscan culture through violence or persecution. They absorbed it, adopted its useful elements, discarded the rest, and gradually replaced the Etruscan language and Etruscan identity with Latin speech and Roman identity. The destruction of Etruscan culture was not a conquest in the traditional sense. It was an assimilation, a slow, thorough, and ultimately total process of cultural replacement that left the Etruscans present in Rome's foundations, but absent from its consciousness. The assimilation was aided by a peculiar feature of Etruscan political organization. The Etruscans never formed a unified state. Their city-states were independent, linked by religious ties and cultural affinities, but politically autonomous. They cooperated in a loose league, the Dodecapolis, or League of 12 Cities, but the league had no central authority, no standing army, and no mechanism for coordinated military action. This political fragmentation made the Etruscans vulnerable to the Romans, who could conquer and absorb the Etruscan city-states one by one over a period of centuries without ever facing a united Etruscan resistance. The process began in the late 4th century before the Common Era, with the Roman conquest of Veii, and continued through the 3rd and 2nd centuries, ending with the complete incorporation of all Etruscan territory into the Roman state by roughly the 1st century before the Common Era. The political absorption was followed by linguistic absorption. Latin replaced Etruscan as the language of administration, commerce, and public life. Etruscan retreated to the domains of religion and private ritual, where it persisted, in gradually diminishing form, for perhaps another century or two. The last known Etruscan inscriptions date to the 1st century before the Common Era. The last reference to Etruscan speakers, as opposed to Etruscan texts, dates to roughly the same period. By the time of the Roman Empire, the Etruscan language was a scholarly curiosity. studied by antiquarians like Claudius, referenced by encyclopedists like Pliny, but spoken by no one. The process by which the Etruscan language died deserves detailed attention because it illuminates a pattern of linguistic replacement that has repeated itself thousands of times across human history, and that continues today. The death of Etruscan was not a single event. It was a process that unfolded over roughly 3 centuries, from the beginning of Roman expansion into Etruria in the 4th century, before the Common Era, to the final disappearance of the language in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era. The process began with bilingualism. As Roman political and economic influence spread through Etruria, Etruscan elites began to learn Latin, the language of the new power, the language of opportunity, the language of the wider Mediterranean world that Rome was in the process of unifying. The earliest signs of bilingualism appear in the 3rd century before the Common Era, when Etruscan inscriptions begin to include occasional Latin words and when some inscriptions begin to appear in both Etruscan and Latin versions. These bilingual inscriptions are invaluable for scholarship. They provide the cross-references that allow Etruscan words to be matched to Latin equivalents, but they are also tombstones for the Etruscan language, each one a marker of the advancing frontier of Romanization, a sign that the Etruscan speaker who produced it was already living in 2 linguistic worlds. The second phase was domain restriction. As Latin became the language of administration, commerce, and public life, Etruscan retreated to the domains of religion, private ritual, and family tradition. The Etruscans continued to write funerary inscriptions in Etruscan. The domain of death was conservative, resistant to linguistic change. They continued to inscribe votive offerings in Etruscan. The domain of the sacred was equally conservative, but the domains of public life, politics, law, commerce, shifted to Latin. The inscriptions reflect this shift. The latest Etruscan texts are predominantly funerary and votive, while the Latin inscriptions from the same period and the same region cover a much wider range of subjects. The third phase was intergenerational transmission failure. At some point, different for different families, different for different communities, Etruscan parents stopped speaking Etruscan to their children. The children grew up speaking Latin. The grandchildren might have heard Etruscan from their grandparents, but did not speak it. The great-grandchildren never heard it at all. Within 3 or 4 generations, the language was extinct in that family, in that community, in that city. The process was repeated, community by community, across the length and breadth of Etruria, until no community maintained the language and no family transmitted it. The Roman writer Varro, writing in the 1st century before the Common Era, refers to Etruscan as a language still understood by some, implying that it was no longer commonly spoken, but that living speakers, or at least competent readers, still existed. The Emperor Claudius, writing roughly a century later, had to learn Etruscan as a scholarly language. He studied it the way a modern scholar might study Latin or Sanskrit, as a dead language preserved in texts rather than in living speech. By Claudius's time, Etruscan was already dead as a spoken language. It survived only in the religious texts that Roman priests continued to consult for divinatory purposes, and even this residual use was probably conducted by specialists who knew Etruscan formulas by rote rather than as a living language. The death of Etruscan was, by the standards of language death, unremarkable. Languages die this way all the time, absorbed by more powerful neighbours, replaced by more useful alternatives, abandoned by speakers who make the rational calculation that the dominant language offers better opportunities for their children. The Etruscan case is remarkable not because the mechanism of death was unusual, but because the victim was exceptional. A language of a major civilization, a vehicle of a cultural tradition that shaped the entire Western Mediterranean, a medium of expression for a people who, by any measure, were among the most creative and most accomplished in the ancient world. If a language of this stature can die, any language can die. But where did the Etruscans come from? The question has been debated since antiquity. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, claimed that the Etruscans, whom the Greeks called Tyrrhenians, had migrated to Italy from Lydia, in western Anatolia, fleeing a devastating famine. His account was specific and circumstantial. He named the Lydian king who ordered the migration, described the circumstances of the departure, and identified the leader of the migrating group. The story was widely accepted in the ancient world and was repeated by numerous later writers. But Herodotus's contemporary Dionysius of Halicarnassus disagreed. Writing 4 centuries later, Dionysius argued that the Etruscans were indigenous to Italy, that they had developed in situ, without any migration from the east. Dionysius based his argument partly on linguistic evidence. He observed that the Etruscan language was unlike any language he knew, including Lydian, and concluded that the Etruscans could not have come from Lydia because their language bore no resemblance to Lydian speech. Modern scholarship has not resolved the debate, though it has added layers of nuance. Genetic studies conducted in the 21st century, analyzing both modern Tuscan DNA and ancient DNA extracted from Etruscan tombs, have produced mixed results. Some studies have found genetic links between Etruscan populations and populations in the eastern Mediterranean, consistent with Herodotus's migration theory. Others have found that Etruscan DNA is broadly consistent with other Italian populations, supporting Dionysius's indigenous origin theory. The most recent and most comprehensive study, published in 2021, concluded that the Etruscans were genetically similar to their Latin and other Italic neighbours, and that there was no evidence of a large-scale migration from Anatolia. The Etruscans, it seems, were local, Italian in origin, Mediterranean in culture, and linguistically unique in every direction. This linguistic uniqueness is the central fact of the Etruscan language and the primary obstacle to its full understanding. Every other major language of ancient Italy belonged to the Indo-European language family. Latin, Oscan, Umbrian, Faliscan, Venetic, and others were all members of the Italic branch of Indo-European, related to each other and to the broader family that includes Greek, Sanskrit, Germanic, Celtic, and Slavic languages. The Indo-European family provides a comparative framework of extraordinary power by comparing cognate words across related languages, words that derive from a common ancestor. Linguists can reconstruct the vocabulary, grammar, and phonology of the ancestral language and use that reconstruction to illuminate the meaning of obscure or poorly attested members of the family. This comparative method is the most powerful tool in the historical linguist's arsenal. It has been used to decipher and interpret dozens of ancient languages, from Hittite to Tocharian to Mycenaean Greek. Etruscan stands outside this framework. It is not Indo-European. It is not Semitic. It is not Anatolian, despite Herodotus's claim of Lydian origin. Detailed linguistic comparison has found no systematic relationship between Etruscan and any Anatolian language. It is not related to Basque, despite periodic proposals to this effect. It is not related to any language family that has been identified anywhere in the world. There is one possible relative, the Raetic language, attested by a small number of inscriptions found in the Alps, in what is now northeastern Italy and Austria. Raetic inscriptions, which date to the first millennium before the Common Era, show structural and lexical similarities to Etruscan that some linguists consider significant enough to posit a genetic relationship, a common ancestor from which both Etruscan and Raetic descended. The linguist Helmut Rix, one of the foremost Etruscan scholars of the 20th century, proposed a Ticenian language family comprising Etruscan, Raetic, and the language of the Lemnos Stele, a 6th century inscription found on the Greek island of Lemnos that bears a text in a language with apparent Etruscan affinities. The Lemnos Stele is a particularly intriguing piece of evidence. It was found on an island in the northeastern Aegean, far from the Etruscan heartland in central Italy, and it bears an inscription in a language that shares several features with Etruscan: similar word endings, similar morphological patterns, and a few apparent vocabulary matches. The stele has been interpreted as evidence that a Ticenian-speaking population once inhabited Lemnos, a population that may have been related to the Etruscans and that may represent a remnant of a wider Ticenian-speaking area that once extended across the Aegean. This interpretation is consistent with Herodotus's claim that the Etruscans originated in the eastern Mediterranean. Though it does not prove it, since the linguistic relationship could equally be explained by migration in the opposite direction, from Italy to the Aegean, or by the existence of a widely distributed language family that spanned both regions. The Tersenian hypothesis, if correct, would provide a modest comparative framework for Etruscan studies, a framework consisting of Etruscan, Rhaetic, and Lemnian, all of which could be compared to illuminate each other. But the framework would be extremely limited. The Rhaetic corpus consists of roughly 300 inscriptions, almost all very short, comparable in size and informativeness to the shortest Etruscan funerary inscriptions. The Lemnian corpus consists of a single stele. The comparative data that these sources provide is minimal. Comparing Etruscan to Rhaetic is like trying to understand English by comparing it to Scots. The two are related, but the one does not illuminate the other to anything like the degree that comparison with, say, German or French or Latin would provide. The Ticenian hypothesis has gained support but remains unproven. Even if Etruscan, Rhaetic, and Lemnian are related, the family is tiny. 3 languages, all poorly attested, none fully understood. The comparative data that such a tiny family provides is minimal compared to the vast comparative resources of the Indo-European, Semitic, or Sino-Tibetan families. The practical consequence of Etruscan's isolation is devastating for the project of linguistic interpretation. When a scholar encounters an obscure Latin word, they can compare it to cognates in Oscan, Umbrian, Greek, Sanskrit, and other Indo-European languages, often arriving at a confident interpretation through the convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence. When a scholar encounters an obscure Etruscan word, they have nothing to compare it to. The word stands alone. Its meaning must be inferred from context, from the object on which it appears, from the type of inscription in which it occurs, from its position relative to other words whose meanings have been established. Context is valuable, but it is not the same as comparison. Context constrains, comparison confirms. Without comparison, constraint is all there is. And constraint, applied to a poorly understood language with a limited corpus of extended texts, yields interpretations that are plausible but rarely certain. The Etruscan alphabet, by contrast, is well understood, and its clarity only sharpens the frustration. The Etruscans adopted their alphabet from the Greek colonists of Cumae in the Bay of Naples, sometime in the 8th century before the Common Era. The adaptation was straightforward. The Etruscans took the Greek letter forms and assigned them to Etruscan sounds, modifying the inventory to fit the phonological system of their own language. The resulting alphabet, sometimes called the Old Italic alphabet, consisted of roughly 26 letters in its earliest form, later reduced to roughly 20 as the Etruscans dropped letters for sounds that did not occur in their language. The letter forms are recognizable. An Etruscan A looks like a Greek alpha, an Etruscan M looks like a Greek mu, and the sound values are established with high confidence based on the consistency of the spelling system, on comparison with the Greek original, and on the analysis of bilingual or digraphic inscriptions that provide cross-references between Etruscan and Latin or Greek. The result is a paradox that is unique in the world of ancient languages. A language that can be read aloud with confidence, but that cannot be understood with confidence. A scholar can pick up an Etruscan inscription, sound out every word, and produce a fluent spoken rendition of the text, and have only the vaguest idea of what they just said. The sounds are clear, the meaning is dark, the door is transparent, and the room behind it is pitch black. The Etruscan inscribed bronze mirrors provide a particularly vivid illustration of this paradox. The Etruscans produced thousands of bronze mirrors, polished on one side for reflection, and engraved on the other with mythological scenes. Many of these scenes include labels, short inscriptions identifying the figures depicted. These labels are among the most immediately legible Etruscan texts, because the figures they identify are often characters from Greek mythology whose Etruscan names can be matched to their Greek equivalents. Atunis is Adonis, Aplu is Apollo, Artemis is Artemis, Fuflans is Dionysus, Turin is Aphrodite, Menvra is Minerva, or more precisely, Minerva is the Latin name derived from the Etruscan Menvra. These identifications are secure and informative. They tell us that the Etruscans adopted and adapted Greek mythology, giving Greek deities Etruscan names and incorporating them into Etruscan religious practice. They tell us something about Etruscan phonology, the way Etruscan sound patterns modified Greek names, and they contribute to the known vocabulary. Divine names are, after personal names, the largest category of confidently identified Etruscan words. But the mirror labels also reveal the limits of this kind of identification. Many mirror scenes depict figures who are labeled with Etruscan names that do not correspond to any known Greek or Roman deity. Who is Alpan? Who is Lassa? Who is Vanth? These are Etruscan divine or mythological figures with no Greek equivalent. Figures who belong to an Etruscan mythology that is, in its specifics, unknown. The mirrors show us what these figures look like. They do not tell us what they mean, what their stories are, what their functions are, what role they play in the Etruscan understanding of the cosmos. The names are readable. The mythology behind the names is lost. There is also a small but valuable body of Etruscan words, preserved as glosses. Brief explanations or translations provided by Latin and Greek authors who encountered Etruscan terms in the course of their own writing. The Roman scholar Varro, the encyclopedist Pliny, and a handful of other authors occasionally mention Etruscan words, providing Latin translations or explanations. These glosses add to the known vocabulary. The word ease, or ease, meaning God, was confirmed by a gloss in a Latin text, for example, and the word netzvis, meaning haruspex, a diviner who reads animal entrails, is attested in both Etruscan inscriptions and Latin glosses. But the glosses are few, perhaps 30 or 40 in total, and they are often ambiguous. The Latin authors who provided them were not linguists. They were writers who encountered an Etruscan term in the course of discussing Etruscan customs, and who paused to explain it for their Latin-speaking audience. Their explanations are approximate rather than precise, and they are filtered through the conceptual framework of the Latin language, which may not map neatly onto the Etruscan original. A Latin author who glosses an Etruscan religious term as sacerdos, priest, may be providing an accurate translation or an approximate equivalent that misses the specific nuances of the Etruscan concept. Without access to the full Etruscan context, the accuracy of the gloss cannot be verified. This paradox, readability without comprehensibility, defines the Etruscan problem and distinguishes it from every other undeciphered or partially understood ancient language. Linear A cannot be read at all because the script records an unknown language and the sound values of many signs are uncertain. The Indus Valley script cannot be read at all because the signs cannot be matched to sounds. Rongorongo cannot be read at all because the entire system is opaque. Etruscan can be read. It can be pronounced. It can be transcribed into the International Phonetic Alphabet. It can be spoken aloud in a classroom. What it cannot be, in any but the most basic and formulaic texts, is understood. The Etruscan corpus is substantial but unbalanced. Of the roughly 13,000 known inscriptions, the overwhelming majority are funerary, brief texts inscribed on tombs, sarcophagi, cinerary urns, and grave markers. A typical funerary inscription reads something like, Velsates, son of Larth, died at age 42. The formula varies, but the structure is consistent. A personal name, a patronymic, the father's name, sometimes a matronymic, the mother's name, sometimes an age at death, sometimes a title or office. These inscriptions are understood with reasonable confidence because the formulaic structure and the cross-referencing of names with Latin sources constrain the interpretation. But the funerary inscriptions, while numerous, are linguistically impoverished. They use a limited vocabulary, names, kinship terms, numbers, and a small set of formulaic expressions. They do not reveal the grammar of the language in any depth. They do not provide vocabulary for abstract concepts, for narrative discourse, for legal or religious or philosophical expression. They are, linguistically speaking, the equivalent of a graveyard full of headstones. They tell you who was buried there, but they do not tell you what those people thought, believed, or said when they were alive. The longer texts, the texts that would reveal the full depth and complexity of the Etruscan language, are few, and each one is a treasure of incalculable value. The most important are the Liber Linteus Zagrabiensis, the Zagreb Linen Book, the longest surviving Etruscan text. It is written on linen, a textile book, a format that is unique among surviving ancient documents. The linen was reused in antiquity as wrapping for an Egyptian mummy, which is how it survived. The dry conditions of the Egyptian desert preserved the fabric that the Italian climate would have destroyed. The text contains approximately 1,300 words and appears to be a religious calendar, a set of ritual prescriptions specifying the dates, locations, and procedures for various religious ceremonies. The Labyrinthus is the single most important Etruscan text, and its interpretation has consumed generations of scholars. Parts of it are understood: dates, divine names, ritual actions, but the overall meaning of many passages remains uncertain. The Tabula Capuana, the Capua tile, a terracotta tile inscribed with approximately 390 words that, like the Labyrinthus, appears to contain a religious or ritual text. Its interpretation is partial and contested. The Tabula Cortonensis, the Cortona tablet, a bronze tablet discovered in 1992 bearing approximately 200 words that appear to relate to a land transaction or a legal agreement. Its interpretation has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate. The Sippus Perusinus, the Perugia stone, a stone boundary marker bearing approximately 130 words that also appear to relate to a property transaction between two families. The Pergi tablets, 3 gold tablets found in 1964 at the site of ancient Pergi, the port of the Etruscan city of Cerveteri. 2 of the tablets are inscribed in Etruscan and 1 in Phoenician. The Phoenician text provides a partial bilingual, a text in a known language that overlaps in content with the Etruscan text, and has been the most important single aid in the interpretation of Etruscan vocabulary and grammar. But the overlap is partial, not exact. The Etruscan and Phoenician texts are not translations of each other, but parallel dedications that share some content and diverge in others. The bilingual is helpful but not decisive. These texts, perhaps a dozen in total, ranging from 100 to 1,300 words, constitute the entire body of extended Etruscan prose that has survived. Everything else is formulaic, fragmentary, or too short to provide significant linguistic information. The entire Etruscan literary tradition, the epics, the histories, the philosophical works, the legal codes that a civilization of the Etruscan sophistication almost certainly produced, is lost. The Roman Emperor Claudius, who was a scholar of Etruscan language and culture, wrote a 20-volume history of the Etruscans in the 1st century of the Common Era. It has not survived. Not a single line of it has been preserved in quotation by later authors. The most comprehensive study of Etruscan civilization ever written, composed by a Roman emperor who could read the language, is gone. The loss of Claudius's history is emblematic of the broader pattern of Etruscan textual loss. The Etruscans were a literate civilization. They produced texts on a wide range of subjects: religious, legal, historical, scientific. The Roman writer Varro refers to Etruscan books on divination, on lightning interpretation, and on the rituals of city foundation. Cicero mentions Etruscan texts on augury and haruspicy, the interpretation of omens, and the examination of animal entrails for prophetic purposes. Livy refers to Etruscan historical records. Seneca mentions Etruscan theories about the nature of lightning. These references make clear that the Etruscans possessed a substantial body of literature, a body of text that, if it survived, would make the Etruscan language fully comprehensible. It does not survive. The Etruscan literary tradition was written on perishable materials: linen, wood, wax tablets, and possibly papyrus, none of which endures in the Italian climate. The only Etruscan texts that survive are those that were inscribed on durable materials: stone, bronze, terracotta, gold, and these by their nature tend to be short, formulaic, and uninformative about the deeper structures of the language. The Etruscans wrote their most important texts on their most perishable media. The result is the paradox that defines Etruscan studies. A civilization that was thoroughly literate has left behind a linguistic record that is almost entirely composed of the equivalent of road signs and gravestones. The Etruscans' Roman successors did not preserve the Etruscan literary heritage. The Romans adopted Etruscan religious practices, Etruscan architectural techniques, and Etruscan administrative methods, but they did not preserve Etruscan texts. The process of Romanization, the gradual absorption of Etruscan culture into the expanding Roman state, involved the replacement of the Etruscan language by Latin, the conversion of Etruscan institutions into Roman ones, and the reinterpretation of Etruscan history through a Roman lens. By the 1st century, before the Common Era, the Etruscan language was moribund, spoken only by a dwindling number of elderly individuals in rural communities, studied by a handful of Roman antiquarians, and no longer used for any public or official purpose. By the 1st century of the Common Era, it was dead. The death of the Etruscan language was not sudden or violent. It was a slow, generational process of linguistic replacement, the same process that has killed languages throughout human history, and that continues to kill languages today. Each generation of Etruscans was slightly more bilingual than the last. Each generation used Latin slightly more and Etruscan slightly less. The tipping point, the moment when the community stopped transmitting Etruscan to its all children, probably occurred at different times in different communities, spreading from the cities, where contact with Latin-speaking Romans was most intense, to the countryside, where traditional Etruscan-speaking communities persisted longer. By the time the last Etruscan speaker died, an event that is unrecorded and that probably occurred sometime in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, the language had been fading for centuries. Its death was not a rupture, it was an exhaustion, and with the death of the language died the possibility of full comprehension. A living language can be learned, studied, and used as a key to its own earlier forms. A dead language with living relatives can be illuminated through comparison. A dead language without relatives and without a substantial bilingual corpus is, for all practical purposes, a sealed vault. You can hear the echoes, you cannot read the documents. The core problem of Etruscan is not that we know nothing, it is that we know just enough to understand how much we are missing. This is a more unsettling condition than total ignorance. If Etruscan were completely opaque, if we could not read the script, could not identify the sounds, could not pass the inscriptions into words, then the situation would be comparable to that of the Indus Valley script, or the Phaistos disc. A mystery sealed behind an impenetrable wall. But Etruscan is not impenetrable, it is translucent. We can see shapes through the glass. We can make out outlines. We can identify some features with confidence. But the details, the fine grain of meaning, the nuances of expression, the full vocabulary of thought and feeling are blurred beyond recognition. Consider what we do know. We know the phonological system of Etruscan, the inventory of sounds that the language used, and the way those sounds were represented in the alphabet. We know that Etruscan had a 4-vowel system, A, E, I, U, without the O that is present in most Indo-European languages. We know that Etruscan had a set of aspirated consonants, sounds produced with a strong burst of air, that were characteristic of the language and that distinguished it from its Italic neighbours. We know that Etruscan stress fell on the first syllable of a word, a feature that caused the unstressed vowels in later syllables to weaken and sometimes disappear, producing the consonant clusters that give Etruscan words their distinctive, sometimes forbidding appearance. Words like klinar, son, zilath, magistrate, and trutvesi, a type of ritual performer. We know a substantial vocabulary, perhaps 700 to 1,000 words, whose meanings are established with varying degrees of confidence. The most securely known words are names, personal names, family names, divine names, and place names, which can be cross-referenced with Latin and Greek sources. After names, the next most securely known category is kinship terms. Clan for son, sek for daughter, puya for wife, ati for mother, appa for father. These are established through the analysis of funerary formulae, in which the relationships between the deceased and their family members are stated in predictable patterns. Numerals are also partially known. The words for 1 through 6 are established with reasonable confidence based on the analysis of dice inscribed with Etruscan number words and on the study of numerical formulae in funerary and votive texts. Beyond names, kinship terms, and numbers, the vocabulary becomes progressively less certain. Religious terminology, legal terminology, and abstract vocabulary are known only through context-dependent inferences that are often disputed. The Etruscan dice are themselves a fascinating case study in the difficulty of interpreting an isolated language. Several pairs of Etruscan dice have been found, each face inscribed with an Etruscan word, rather than with the dots that are conventional on modern dice. The 6 words, Mac, Zal, Thu, Huth, Ki, and Sha are assumed to represent the numbers 1 through 6 because dice conventionally bear the numbers 1 through 6 on their 6 faces. This assumption is almost certainly correct. But which word represents which number? The constraint that the opposite faces of a die must add up to 7, a convention observed in virtually all known dice traditions, provides 3 equations. The first and 6th words sum to 7, the second and 5th sum to 7, and the third and 4th sum to 7. These equations constrain the assignment but do not determine it uniquely. Several different assignments are consistent with the opposite face constraint, and scholars have debated the correct assignment for over a century. The debate might seem trivial. What does it matter whether Huth means 4 or 3? But it illustrates a fundamental feature of Etruscan studies. Even the simplest questions about the language often have multiple plausible answers and no definitive resolution. If we cannot determine with certainty which Etruscan word means 4, how can we hope to determine what an Etruscan priest meant when he prescribed a specific ritual offering to a specific deity on a specific date? The uncertainty scales with the complexity of the question, and the questions that matter most, the questions about Etruscan religion, philosophy, law, and history, are the most complex of all. The funerary inscriptions, while well understood in their general structure, also illustrate the limits of formulaic analysis. A typical funerary inscription from a Tarquinian tomb reads, in transliteration, Larf Velcher Velcina's clan, Avils Rupchexel Vitri. In translation, Larf Velcher, son of Velcina, lived 48 years. The structure is clear. Personal name, patronymic, kinship term, clan, means son, a phrase indicating age at death. The word avils is understood to mean of years. It is the genitive plural of avil, meaning year. The word rups is understood to mean something like lived or reached the age of. Its exact semantic range is uncertain, but its function in the formula is clear. This level of understanding is satisfying as far as it goes. But notice what it does not include. It does not tell us what Larth Velcher did for a living. It does not tell us what he believed about death. It does not tell us what his family hoped for him in the afterlife. It does not tell us how Etruscan society was organized, how justice was administered, how political power was distributed, or how the relationship between the living and the dead was conceptualized. The funerary inscription tells us that Larth Velcher lived and died. It does not tell us what it meant to live and die as an Etruscan. For that, we would need the texts that have been lost. The ritual texts, the legal texts, the historical narratives, the philosophical reflections that a civilization of the Etruscan sophistication must have produced, and that have perished along with the linen and wood on which they were written. We know something about Etruscan grammar, but less than we would like, and less than the size of the corpus might suggest. We know that Etruscan was an agglutinative language, a language in which grammatical relationships are expressed by adding suffixes to word stems, producing long, complex word forms. We know that Etruscan nouns had at least 4 cases: a nominative, an accusative or direct object case, a genitive or possessive case, and a locative or place case, distinguished by specific suffixes. We know that Etruscan verbs had past and present tenses, active and passive voices, and a distinction between what appear to be indicative and subjunctive moods. We know that Etruscan sentence structure was, at least in some contexts, subject-object-verb, a word order that is common in agglutinative languages, and that differs from the subject-verb-object order that is typical of English and Latin. This is, by the standards of most undeciphered languages, a remarkable amount of knowledge. A scholar who knows the phonology, the basic vocabulary, the morphological system, and the word order of a language has a substantial foundation on which to build further understanding. For most languages, this foundation would be sufficient to permit the reading of extended texts with a reasonable degree of comprehension. For Etruscan, it is not sufficient. And the reason it is not sufficient is the language's isolation. In the study of dead languages, the comparative method serves as a multiplier, a tool that amplifies the value of every piece of direct evidence. When a Latinist encounters an obscure Latin word, they do not rely solely on the Latin evidence. They compare the word to its cognates in Oscan, Umbrian, Greek, Sanskrit, Gothic, and other Indo-European languages. Each cognate provides an independent data point, a separate line of evidence that constrains the range of possible meanings. The convergence of multiple independent lines of evidence typically produces a confident interpretation, even when any single line of evidence would be ambiguous. For Etruscan, the comparative method is unavailable. There are no cognates. There are no related languages. Every obscure Etruscan word must be interpreted from the Etruscan evidence alone, from the contexts in which it appears, from its morphological structure, from its position in sentences, and from whatever inferences can be drawn from the objects on which it is inscribed. These are all valid methods of linguistic analysis, but they are all context-dependent methods. Methods that yield interpretations that are constrained by context but not confirmed by independent evidence. The result is a body of scholarship in which many interpretations are plausible, few are certain, and none can be verified by the kind of convergent evidence that the comparative method provides. The Purgi tablets illustrate both the power and the limitations of the available evidence. The tablets, found in 1964 at the Sanctuary of Purgi, consist of 2 Etruscan texts and 1 Phoenician text, all inscribed on gold sheets and dating to approximately 500 before the Common Era. The Phoenician text is a dedication by a ruler named Thephria Velianus to the goddess Astarte, recording the construction or dedication of a temple in her honor. The longer Etruscan text appears to describe the same event, the dedication of a sacred space by the same ruler, but the correspondence is not exact. The 2 texts share some content and diverge in others. They are not translations of each other. They are parallel compositions, 2 texts about the same event, composed independently in 2 different languages. The discovery of the Purgi tablets was a moment of intense excitement in the field. For over a century, scholars had been hoping for a bilingual, a Rosetta Stone for Etruscan, and the Purgi tablets seemed to be the answer to their prayers. The gold sheets were rushed to the laboratory. The Phoenician text was translated within days. The Etruscan texts were subjected to intense analysis by every specialist in the field. The initial results were promising. The name of the ruler, Thephria Velianus, could be identified in both the Phoenician and the Etruscan texts, providing a fixed point of reference. The name of the deity, Astarte in Phoenician, Uni in Etruscan, provided a second fixed point, confirming that the Etruscan Uni, the equivalent of the Roman Juno, was identified with the Phoenician Astarte. The word timia in the Etruscan text appeared to correspond to the Phoenician word for temple or sacred precinct. The word avil in the Etruscan text corresponded to a calendrical element in the Phoenician text, confirming its meaning as year. These identifications were genuine and valuable. They added new vocabulary items to the known Etruscan lexicon and confirmed previous interpretations of several important words. They demonstrated that Etruscan uni was functionally equivalent to Phoenician Astarte, a finding with important implications for the understanding of Etruscan religion, and they provided new data on Etruscan grammar, the way the Etruscan text expressed dedication, consecration, and the relationship between ruler and deity. But the limitations of the bilingual became apparent almost as quickly as the results. The Etruscan text is not a translation of the Phoenician text. It is a separate composition that covers some of the same ground, but diverges in important ways. The Etruscan text is longer than the Phoenician text, and contains passages that have no parallel in the Phoenician. Passages whose interpretation cannot be guided by the bilingual comparison. The portions of the Etruscan text that do parallel the Phoenician are too short and too formulaic to provide comprehensive grammatical information. The bilingual helps, it does not transform. The Purgi tablets have been the most important single aid for the interpretation of Etruscan vocabulary and grammar, because the Phoenician text provides a framework within which the Etruscan text can be partially interpreted. Key vocabulary items: the name of the ruler, the name of the deity, the word for temple, the word for dedication, can be identified by matching elements of the Etruscan text to corresponding elements of the Phoenician text. Grammatical structures can be inferred by comparing the ways in which the two texts express similar ideas. The tablets have contributed more to the understanding of Etruscan than any other single discovery. But the tablets have also revealed the limitations of partial bilingual evidence. The Phoenician text is short, only 40 words. The Etruscan texts are not much longer. The vocabulary they share is limited to a narrow range of religious and dedicatory terminology. The grammatical correspondences they provide are confined to a few specific constructions. The tablets illuminate a small corner of the Etruscan language, the corner that deals with temple dedication and divine worship, and leave the rest in darkness. They are a window, but a small one, opening onto a narrow view. But here is the problem. The Etruscan language is not merely missing vocabulary. It is missing the framework that would allow vocabulary to be systematically expanded. In a well-documented language, one with a large corpus, a known language family, and a rich tradition of bilingual texts, new vocabulary is constantly being added to the known inventory as scholars encounter new words and interpret them using the tools at their disposal. In Etruscan, the process of vocabulary expansion has nearly stalled. The low-hanging fruit has been picked. The words that can be identified from context, from formulaic patterns, and from the Purgi tablets have been identified. The remaining unknown vocabulary consists of words that appear in contexts too ambiguous to constrain their meaning, in texts too poorly understood to provide reliable interpretation, and in isolation from any comparative framework that could confirm or deny proposed readings. The linguist Giuliano Bonfante, who collaborated with his daughter Larissa Bonfante on one of the standard reference works on the Etruscan language, described the situation with a metaphor that has become classic in the field. Reading Etruscan, Bonfante said, is like reading a newspaper in a language you have studied for only a few weeks. You recognize many of the common words. You can identify the topic of an article from its headline. You can follow the general drift of a story, but the details escape you. The nuances are lost. The jokes are incomprehensible, and the editorials, the passages that express opinion, argument, and complex thought, are completely opaque. And it gets worse, because the opacity of Etruscan is not uniform. It varies dramatically depending on the type of text. Funerary inscriptions are largely understood. Votive dedications are partially understood. Legal texts are poorly understood. Religious texts, the texts that would reveal the most about Etruscan thought, belief, and worldview, are the most poorly understood of all, because they employ a specialized vocabulary of ritual terminology that appears nowhere else in the corpus, and that has no parallels in any known language. The Liber Linteus, the Zagreb Linen book, the longest Etruscan text, exemplifies this problem with devastating clarity. The text contains approximately 1,300 words, organized into what appear to be sections corresponding to different dates in a ritual calendar. The structure is partially understood. The dates can be identified. The names of deities can be recognized, and certain ritual actions, libation, sacrifice, offering, can be inferred from context. But the specific instructions, what exactly is to be done, with what materials, by whom, in what order, with what words, are largely opaque. The ritual vocabulary is specialized, technical, and without parallel. Words that appear in the Liber Linteus, and nowhere else in the Etruscan corpus, and there are many such words, are by definition uninterpretable because there is no context against which to check them, no comparative evidence against which to test them, and no bilingual text that translates them. The Liber Linteus deserves extended attention because it is the single most important and most frustrating document in Etruscan studies. The text was discovered in the most improbable way imaginable. In the 19th century, an Egyptian mummy was acquired by a Croatian official named Mihail de Baric, who brought it back to Zagreb and eventually donated it to the Croatian National Museum. When museum conservators unwrapped the mummy, they discovered that the linen wrappings bore writing, not Egyptian writing, but Etruscan writing. The linen had been cut into strips and reused as mummy wrapping, probably in the Ptolemaic period, by an Egyptian embalmer who either did not know or did not care that the cloth was inscribed with a foreign text. How a book of Etruscan linen ended up in an Egyptian mummification workshop is one of the more colourful puzzles in the history of textual transmission. The most likely explanation is that the book was brought to Egypt by an Etruscan emigrant, perhaps a merchant or a traveller, and that after its owner died, the book was sold or discarded and ended up in the hands of an embalmer who found the linen a convenient wrapping material. The desert conditions of Egypt preserved the linen that the Italian climate would have destroyed, and the text that was never meant to leave Etruria survived for over 2,000 years in a tomb on the banks of the Nile. The irony is exquisite. The Etruscan literary tradition perished in Italy, where the Etruscans actually lived, because the climate destroyed the organic materials on which Etruscan texts were written. The single longest Etruscan text survived because it was transported to a completely different cultural context. A context in which its linguistic content was irrelevant, but its physical medium was useful and was preserved by the accident of Egyptian burial practices and Egyptian desert conditions. The text was saved not by the Etruscans, but by the Egyptians, not because they valued it, but because they did not. The text itself, as preserved, consists of approximately 1,300 words, arranged in what appears to be a series of entries, each beginning with a date specification and followed by ritual instructions. The dates use the Etruscan calendar, a system that is itself only partially understood, and the ritual instructions include the names of deities, the names of specific offerings, and verbs that appear to prescribe specific actions. The word vakal appears to mean libation or offering. The word fleur appears to mean sacred image or offering. The word seli appears to refer to a month name. The word Isna appears to be related to Is, God, and may mean divine or sacred. These identifications are the product of decades of painstaking combinatorial analysis. The comparison of every occurrence of each word across all known Etruscan texts, the tabulation of every context in which each word appears, and the gradual accumulation of probabilistic constraints that narrow the range of possible meanings. The identifications are not certain. They are the best current estimates, interpretations that are consistent with the available evidence, but that might need to be revised if new evidence emerges. The bulk of the Labyrinthus, the specific ritual instructions, the details of the ceremonies, the names and attributes of the deities addressed, the theological rationale behind the prescribed actions, remains opaque. The text is there, the words are legible, the phonology is clear, and the meaning, the specific, detailed, theologically rich meaning that would reveal the inner workings of Etruscan religion, is as remote as if the text were written in a script that no one could read. The religious core of Etruscan civilization, the elaborate system of divination, augury, and ritual practice that the Romans themselves regarded as the Etruscans' most distinctive contribution to Mediterranean culture, is, linguistically, the most inaccessible part of the Etruscan record. The gods are named but not characterized. The rituals are described but not understood. The prayers are preserved but not translated. The Etruscan language gives us the form of the religion but not its content, the sounds of the prayers but not their meaning, the names of the gods but not their stories. But here is what makes this truly terrifying. The knowledge that would make the Etruscan language fully comprehensible once existed. The Romans of the late Republic and early Empire still had access to Etruscan texts, to the religious books, the historical records, the divinatory manuals that would have provided the extended prose necessary to build a comprehensive Etruscan vocabulary and grammar. Claudius, who was emperor from 41 to 54 of the Common Era, could read Etruscan. He wrote a 20-volume history of the Etruscans, a work that presumably drew on Etruscan language sources and that, if it survived, would almost certainly contain enough translated material to make the Etruscan language fully accessible to modern scholarship. The work is lost. Not a single quotation from it survives in any later author. The scholar Jean-René Jeannot, in his comprehensive study of Etruscan religion, has described the loss of Claudius's history as the single most devastating gap in our knowledge of the ancient Mediterranean. Jeannot's assessment is not hyperbolic. A 20-volume work on Etruscan civilization, written by a Roman emperor who knew the language, would have transformed every aspect of Etruscan studies. It would have provided vocabulary, grammar, cultural context, and historical narrative in a quantity and quality that no other source could match. Its loss is not merely regrettable, it is catastrophic. A loss that has condemned Etruscan studies to a permanent condition of partial comprehension from which there may be no escape. The real question is not what burned, it is what we will never know existed. The Etruscan literary tradition, the body of text that would have made the language comprehensible, was vast. We know it was vast because the Romans told us it was vast. Varro, Cicero, Livy, Seneca, Pliny all mention Etruscan texts, Etruscan books, Etruscan learning. The tradition existed, it was substantial, and it is gone, consumed by the same forces of material decay, cultural displacement, and historical indifference that have consumed the literary traditions of so many ancient civilizations. What remains is the paradox, a language we can read but cannot understand, a voice we can hear but cannot comprehend, a civilization that speaks to us across 25 centuries in words that are clear and meanings that are dark. The Etruscans are not silent. That is the cruel irony. They are speaking. They have been speaking for 2,500 years, and we cannot understand what they say. The history of attempts to understand Etruscan illustrates the specific difficulties with painful clarity. The first serious modern effort began in the 18th century when the Italian antiquarian Luigi Lanzi published his Saggio di Lingua Etrusca in 1789, the first systematic study of the Etruscan language based on the analysis of inscriptions. Lanzi correctly identified the Etruscan alphabet as derived from the Greek and established the sound values of most of the letters, a foundational achievement that made all subsequent work possible. He also attempted to interpret Etruscan vocabulary by comparing it to Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, an approach that was methodologically flawed because Etruscan is not related to any of these languages, but that was reasonable given the state of linguistic knowledge at the time. The 19th century saw the accumulation of the corpus, as more and more Etruscan inscriptions were discovered, published, and catalogued. The body of material available for analysis grew steadily. The German philologist Wilhelm Diecke and the Italian scholar Aldo Trombetti published extensive studies of Etruscan grammar and vocabulary, using the growing corpus to identify morphological patterns, establish word classes, and propose interpretations for common terms. Their work laid the groundwork for the modern study of Etruscan, but it also revealed the fundamental limitations of the available methods. The more inscriptions were discovered, the more the scholars could describe the structure of the language. But the ability to describe a structure is not the same as the ability to understand a meaning. And the gap between structure and meaning remains stubbornly wide. The 20th century brought two major methodological advances. The first was the development of the combinatorial method, an approach pioneered by the Italian linguist Massimo Palatino in the 1930s and 40s. A combinatorial method is essentially an intensified form of contextual analysis. It involves the systematic comparison of all contexts in which a particular word appears across the entire corpus in order to constrain the range of possible meanings. If a word appears in 5 different inscriptions, and if the contexts of those 5 inscriptions can be partially understood, then the intersection of the 5 contextual constraints may narrow the possible meanings of the word to a single interpretation, or at least to a small number of plausible interpretations. Palatino's combinatorial method was a significant advance over earlier approaches, which had tended to rely on intuition, on etymological comparison with unrelated languages, or on the assumption that Etruscan words could be explained as borrowings from Latin or Greek. The combinatorial method was rigorous, systematic, and honest about its limitations. It produced interpretations that were explicitly probabilistic, acknowledged the range of uncertainty, and could be updated as new evidence became available. Palatino's approach became the standard methodology in Etruscan studies and remains so today. But the combinatorial method, powerful as it is, has a built-in limitation. It can only produce results as strong as the contexts it analyzes. If the contexts are clear, if the type of inscription, the archaeological setting, and the relationship between the text and its physical object are well understood, then the method can produce confident interpretations. If the contexts are ambiguous, if the type of inscription is uncertain, if the archaeological setting is poorly documented, or if the text bears no clear relationship to its physical object, then the method produces interpretations that are plausible but unverifiable. The majority of Etruscan contexts beyond the funerary formulae are ambiguous, and the combinatorial method applied to ambiguous contexts yields ambiguous results. The second major advance was the discovery of the Purgi tablets in 1964, the partial bilingual that for a brief moment seemed to promise a breakthrough comparable to the Rosetta Stone's role in the decipherment of Egyptian hieroglyphs. The excitement was understandable. A bilingual inscription, a text in both Etruscan and a known language, was the one piece of evidence that Etruscan scholars had been hoping for since the beginning of the modern discipline. The Purgi tablets provided that evidence. The Phoenician text could be read. The Etruscan text could be read aloud. The overlap in content could be exploited to identify Etruscan vocabulary and grammatical structures. But the excitement was tempered by the limitations of the bilingual. The texts were short. The longest Etruscan text on the tablets contains only 37 words. The overlap in content was partial. The Etruscan and Phoenician texts described the same event, but from different perspectives and with different levels of detail. The Phoenician text was itself not without interpretive difficulties. Certain passages were grammatically ambiguous and could be translated in more than one way, and the vocabulary shared between the two texts was confined to a narrow domain, temple dedication and divine worship, that provided little leverage for the interpretation of the broader Etruscan vocabulary. The epigrapher Giovanni Colonna, who has spent decades studying the Purgi tablets, has described them as a gift and a frustration. The gift is real. The tablets have contributed more new Etruscan vocabulary than any other single discovery. The frustration is equally real. The contribution, while significant, has been limited by the brevity and the thematic narrowness of the texts. The tablets answered some questions. They did not answer the big question, which is not, what does this word mean, but how does this language work? The distinction between answering specific vocabulary questions and answering the systemic question of how the language works is crucial. A word-by-word bilingual can tell you that a particular Etruscan word means temple or dedicated or year, but it cannot tell you how Etruscan verbs are conjugated, how relative clauses are formed, how conditional sentences are constructed, or how abstract ideas are expressed. These are systemic features of a language, features that can only be understood through extended prose, through text long enough and varied enough to display the full range of the language's grammatical resources. The Purgi tablets are too short to display these resources. The Labyrinthus is long enough in principle, but too poorly understood in practice. And no other text of comparable length exists. The result is a discipline that knows a great deal about the surface of the Etruscan language, its sounds, its basic vocabulary, its morphological paradigms, but that cannot penetrate to the depth. The surface is clear, the depth is dark, and the tools available to Etruscan scholarship, the combinatorial method, the partial bilingual, the analysis of formulaic patterns, are tools that work well on surfaces but that cannot, by their nature, illuminate depths. Something is wrong with our assumptions. We assume that a language with 13,000 inscriptions should be well understood. The Etruscan case demonstrates that quantity without variety is insufficient, that 13,000 short, formulaic texts provide less linguistic information than a single long, varied document. The Etruscan corpus is broad but shallow. What is needed is depth, and depth, in the form of extended prose, is exactly what the Etruscan corpus lacks. The history of Etruscan interpretation is a history of incremental progress against enormous resistance, a slow, patient accumulation of small gains that, over 2 centuries of sustained scholarship, has produced a substantial but fundamentally incomplete understanding of one of the ancient world's most important languages. Each investigation adds a piece to the puzzle. No investigation completes it. What follows are 5 explorations of the Etruscan problem, each approaching the language from a different angle and each arriving at the same humbling conclusion. We know a great deal about Etruscan, and we understand far less than we know. The first exploration is the study of Etruscan personal names. the most thoroughly understood category of Etruscan vocabulary and the foundation on which all other interpretation rests. The Etruscan onomastic system, the system of personal naming, is remarkably well documented thanks to the abundance of funerary inscriptions and to the cross-referencing of Etruscan names with Latin sources. Etruscan naming conventions followed a predictable pattern: a praenomen, personal name, a gentilicium, family name, and a patronymic, father's name, sometimes supplemented by a matronymic, mother's name, and a cognomen, a distinguishing nickname or title. The system is structurally similar to the Roman naming system, a similarity that is not coincidental, since the Roman system was heavily influenced by Etruscan precedent. The personal names themselves reveal something important about Etruscan society. Unlike Greek or Latin names, which are often transparently meaningful, Aristotle means best purpose, Marcus means dedicated to Mars. Etruscan names are, for the most part, opaque. Names like Vel, Larth, Arnth, and all are common, but their original meanings, if they had any, are unknown. This opacity is a consequence of the language's isolation. Without a comparative framework, the etymologies of Etruscan words, including names, cannot be traced. The names are sounds without histories, labels without origins. The onomastic data has, however, provided one of the most productive avenues for linguistic analysis. By comparing the naming patterns across thousands of funerary inscriptions, scholars have been able to identify the grammatical suffixes that indicate gender, family relationship, and social status. The suffix sa or issa on a woman's family name indicates that she is married into the family. It functions as a feminine possessive. The suffix ol on a name indicates descent or affiliation. The suffix s on a name functions as a genitive, indicating possession or parentage. These morphological identifications, derived from the onomastic data, have been among the most secure and most productive results of Etruscan scholarship. The onomastic data also reveals something about the structure of Etruscan society that no other source provides. The Etruscan naming system included the matronymic, the mother's name, alongside the patronymic, a feature that is unusual in the ancient Mediterranean, and that has been interpreted as evidence of a social system in which maternal descent was significant. In Latin naming conventions, the matronymic is absent. Identity is traced through the father's line exclusively. In Etruscan naming conventions, both parents are regularly identified, suggesting that both paternal and maternal lineage carried social weight. This observation, derived entirely from the analysis of naming formulae, provides a window into Etruscan social organization that is unavailable from any other source. A glimpse of a society in which women's family connections mattered, in which maternal ancestry conferred status, and in which the identity of an individual was defined by both parents rather than by the father alone. The significance of the matronymic has been debated extensively. Some scholars interpret it as evidence of matrilineal descent, a social system in which property, status, and identity were transmitted through the mother's line. Others interpret it more conservatively, as evidence that both parents' families were socially relevant without implying a full matrilineal system. The Roman sources provide some support for the view that Etruscan women held higher social status than women in contemporary Greek or Roman society. The Greek historian Theopompus, whose account is preserved in a fragment quoted by the later writer Athenaeus, described Etruscan women attending banquets alongside men, reclining on couches, drinking wine, and participating in social life in a manner that shocked Greek sensibilities. The tomb paintings at Tarquinia confirm this picture. Women are depicted reclining alongside men at banquets, dressed in elaborate garments, adorned with jewelry, and clearly participating in the social occasion as equals rather than as servants or subordinates. The combination of the onomastic evidence, the literary evidence, and the artistic evidence paints a picture of a society in which women held a social position that was, by the standards of the ancient Mediterranean, remarkably elevated. But the details of this social position, the legal rights, the economic roles, the religious functions, the political influence of Etruscan women, are inaccessible because the texts that would describe them are lost. The funerary inscriptions tell us that Etruscan women had names, families, and social identities. They do not tell us what those women did, thought, or believed. The onomastic data opens a door. The darkness beyond the door is total. But the onomastic data, however rich, is linguistically narrow. Names tell you how a society identifies its members. They do not tell you how the society thinks, believes, argues, or creates. The transition from onomastics to semantics, from understanding who the Etruscans were to understanding what they said, requires a different kind of evidence. Extended prose, in which words are used in full sentences, with all the grammatical complexity and semantic nuance that human language is capable of expressing. And it is precisely this kind of evidence that the Etruscan corpus, despite its size, so conspicuously lacks. The second exploration concerns the Etruscan numerical system, a case study in how even the simplest elements of a language can resist definitive interpretation when the language stands alone. The Etruscan numerals are among the most studied and most debated elements of the language. The problem, as introduced earlier, centers on 6 words found on inscribed dice, 6 words that almost certainly represent the numbers 1 through 6, but whose specific assignments have been debated for over 100 years. The scholar Giuliano Bonfante proposed one assignment. The scholar Massimo Pallottino proposed a different one. The scholar Helmut Rix proposed yet another. Each assignment is consistent with the constraint that opposite faces of a die must sum to 7. None has been universally accepted. The resolution of the numeral problem has been complicated by a remarkable piece of evidence, the so-called Tuscania dice, discovered in a tomb in the Etruscan city of Tuscania. These dice are inscribed with Etruscan number words that match the words on other known dice, but they were found in a context that provides additional constraints. Specifically, one of the dice was found alongside a gaming board that appears to include numerical markings, providing potential cross-references between the Etruscan number words and the numerical values on the board. The cross-referencing has been attempted by several scholars, but the gaming board's own markings are ambiguous, and the interpretation of the board has itself become a subject of debate. The numeral controversy extends to the higher numbers. The Etruscan words for the tens, 20, 30, 40, and so on, are known from funerary inscriptions that record ages at death. The word Zathram appears to mean 20. The word Sealch appears to mean 30. But the exact values are contested. Some scholars reverse the assignment, placing Sealch at 20 and Zathram at 30. The debate hinges on the interpretation of specific inscriptions in which the numerical context provides constraints, but not certainty. When a funerary inscription records that a man died at the age of either 32 or 23, and the Etruscan text could support either reading, the ambiguity extends to every other inscription that uses the same number words. The frustration of the numeral debate is a microcosm of the broader Etruscan problem. The evidence is abundant but underdetermining, the constraints are numerous but insufficient, and every proposed solution is plausible but unverifiable. The Etruscan numerals have been studied by dozens of scholars using every available analytical method. The debate is not closer to resolution today than it was 50 years ago. The data has not changed, the methods have improved, the answer remains uncertain. The third exploration takes us to the most emotionally resonant category of Etruscan text, the tomb paintings and their accompanying inscriptions. The painted tombs of Tarquinia are among the most extraordinary artistic achievements of the ancient Mediterranean. Over 200 painted tombs have been found beneath the streets and fields of modern Tarquinia, their walls covered with vibrant frescoes depicting banqueting scenes, athletic competitions, musical performances, hunting expeditions, and, in later tombs, scenes of the underworld and the journey of the dead to the afterlife. The paintings are executed in a lively, naturalistic style that combines Greek influences with a distinctly Etruscan sensibility, a love of colour, movement, and the pleasures of the flesh that sets Etruscan art apart from the more restrained classicism of Greek painting. The shift in tomb painting subjects over time provides one of the most striking visual narratives of cultural change in the ancient Mediterranean. The earlier tombs, dating to the 6th and 5th centuries before the Common Era, are exuberant, celebrating life even in the context of death. Banqueters feast, dancers leap, musicians play, athletes compete. The colour palette is warm, reds, oranges, yellows, and the atmosphere is one of joyous celebration. The later tombs, dating to the 4th and 3rd centuries before the Common Era, the period of Etruscan decline and Roman expansion, are darker in both palette and mood. The feasting scenes give way to underworld journeys. The dancers are replaced by demons. The warm colours yield to cooler blues and greys. The god Charoon, the Etruscan demon of death, depicted with a hooked nose, pointed ears, and blue-grey skin, wielding a hammer, appears with increasing frequency. The transformation in tomb painting mirrors the transformation of Etruscan society. From confident independence to anxious subordination, from cultural vitality to cultural decline. The inscriptions in the painted tombs accompany this visual narrative but do not fully explain it. The labels identify figures, divine names, personal names, sometimes titles or epithets. The word hinthiel appears to mean soul or shade, the spiritual essence of the deceased. The word Sathena appears to mean of the tomb or funerary. The word Sakni appears to be related to sacred or consecrated. These identifications, derived through the combinatorial method, provide isolated data points within the visual narrative. They do not provide a continuous commentary. The images tell a story that the words can only annotate, and the annotations, however helpful, are too sparse and too uncertain to substitute for the narrative that the images imply, but the texts do not deliver. Many of the painted tombs include inscriptions, labels identifying the figures in the scenes, dedicatory texts naming the tomb's occupant, and occasional longer texts that appear to describe or comment on the depicted scenes. These inscriptions are among the most visually accessible Etruscan texts, painted in large, clear letters on the walls of spaces that were designed to be visited and viewed. And they are among the most frustrating, because the labels, while legible, often identify figures whose significance is unknown, and the longer texts, while pronounceable, often use vocabulary whose meaning can only be guessed. The tomb of the augurs at Tarquinia provides a specific example. The tomb's frescoes depict a scene that appears to show funerary games. Wrestlers, boxers, and other athletes competing in honor of the deceased. One figure is labeled fursu, a word that some scholars have argued is the origin of the Latin persona, meaning mask, and by extension person or character. If this etymology is correct, it is a remarkable linguistic link between Etruscan and one of the most fundamental words in the Western vocabulary of selfhood. But the etymology is disputed, and the precise meaning of fursu in its Etruscan context, whether it refers to a specific performer, a type of character, or a ritual role, remains uncertain. The tomb inscriptions, like the funerary texts, provide tantalizing glimpses of the Etruscan world without providing the sustained, detailed, linguistically rich prose that would make that world fully comprehensible. Each inscription is a window, a small square window, opening onto a narrow view of a vast, dimly lit interior. Through each window you can see a fragment, a name, a title, a figure, a scene. You cannot see the whole room. You cannot see the connections between the fragments. You cannot see the pattern that makes sense of the parts. The room is there. The light is insufficient. The fourth exploration concerns the most important methodological development in Etruscan studies since Palatino, the systematic application of computational methods to the Etruscan corpus. Beginning in the 1980s and accelerating in the 21st century, scholars have applied computational tools, concordance programs, frequency analyzers, morphological parsers, and statistical classifiers to the Etruscan corpus, seeking patterns that manual analysis might miss. The most ambitious of these projects is the Thesaurus Linguae Etruscae, a comprehensive index of every word in every known Etruscan inscription, organized by form, context, and estimated meaning. The Thesaurus, maintained by the Italian National Research Council, is the definitive reference tool for Etruscan vocabulary and has been an invaluable resource for the field. Computational analysis has confirmed and refined many of the observations made by earlier scholars through manual methods. It has confirmed the agglutinative character of Etruscan morphology. It has identified previously unrecognized morphological patterns. It has quantified the frequency distributions of Etruscan words and compared them to the distributions observed in other languages. It has identified co-occurrence patterns words that tend to appear together in specific contexts that constrain the interpretation of individual vocabulary items. The most ambitious recent computational project is the work of the Italian linguist Valentina Belfiore, who has applied network analysis to the Etruscan corpus, mapping the relationships between words based on their co-occurrence in inscriptions and constructing a semantic network that represents the statistical associations between all known Etruscan vocabulary items. Belfiore's network reveals clusters of words that tend to appear together, clusters that correspond to specific domains of meaning: funerary vocabulary, religious vocabulary, legal vocabulary, and so on. Within each cluster, the central words, the words with the most connections to other words in the cluster, are, unsurprisingly, the words whose meanings are best understood. The peripheral words, the words with few connections, are the ones whose meanings are least certain. This network structure is itself informative. It shows that the Etruscan vocabulary was organized into distinct semantic domains, a feature that is characteristic of natural languages, and that further supports the view that the inscriptions encode genuine linguistic content. But the network also reveals the stark asymmetry between the well-understood domains and the poorly understood ones. The funerary domain is densely connected. Many words, many inscriptions, many co-occurrence patterns. The religious domain is sparsely connected. Few words outside the funerary context, few inscriptions, few co-occurrence patterns. The legal domain is barely connected at all. A handful of words from a handful of inscriptions floating at the edge of the network with minimal connections to the rest of the vocabulary. The network analysis confirms, in quantitative terms, what qualitative analysis had already suggested, that the Etruscan corpus is severely lopsided. The funerary domain is overrepresented. Every other domain is underrepresented. And the domains that would be most informative about the Etruscan mind, religion, law, philosophy, history, are the most severely underrepresented of all. The computational tools can identify the unknown words. They can tabulate their frequencies. They can map their distributions. They can list their co-occurrences. But they cannot tell you what they mean. The corpus, while large in terms of the number of inscriptions, is small in terms of unique vocabulary. The approximately 13,000 inscriptions use a total vocabulary of roughly 4,000 to 5,000 distinct word forms, a number that, after accounting for morphological variants of the same base word, reduces to an estimated core vocabulary of perhaps 2,000 to 3,000 distinct lexical items. Of these, perhaps 700 to 1,000 have meanings that are established with some degree of confidence. The remaining 2,000 or more are unknown, words that appear in contexts too ambiguous to constrain their meaning, in texts too short to provide sufficient analytical data, and in isolation from any comparative framework. The computational tools can identify the unknown words. They can tabulate their frequencies. They can map their distributions. They can list their co-occurrences, but they cannot tell you what they mean. The meaning of a word is not a property that can be computed from its form or its distribution. It is a property that must be discovered. Through comparison, through bilingual evidence, through the patient accumulation of contextual constraints. And for the unknown Etruscan vocabulary, the discovery process has stalled. The contexts are too ambiguous. The comparisons are unavailable. The constraints are insufficient. The words remain, after 2 centuries of study, stubbornly, permanently, frustratingly unknown. The 5th exploration is the most recent and the most hopeful, the potential of new archaeological discoveries to transform the field. Etruscan archaeology is an active and productive discipline. New tombs are discovered regularly. New inscriptions emerge from the ground every few years. The possibility of a transformative find, a long text, a comprehensive bilingual, an Etruscan literary work preserved under unusual conditions, is not zero. The discovery of the Tabula Cortinensis in 1992, a bronze tablet bearing a legal text of approximately 200 words, demonstrated that significant new inscriptions can still turn up after centuries of excavation. The tablet added several new words to the known vocabulary, provided new examples of legal and administrative terminology, and stimulated a decade of scholarly debate about Etruscan property law and contractual practice. But the Tabula Cortinensis also demonstrated the limitations of individual discoveries. The tablet added to the corpus. It did not transform it. The new vocabulary it provided was important but narrow, confined to the specific domain of property transactions. The grammatical structures it revealed were consistent with what was already known, but did not extend the grammatical framework in any fundamental way. The tablet was a valuable addition. It was not a breakthrough. The Tabula Cortinensis is, however, one of the most linguistically informative Etruscan texts discovered in recent decades, and it deserves detailed attention. The tablet is a bronze plate, broken into 8 fragments, bearing a text of approximately 200 words arranged in 40 lines. The text appears to record a land transaction, a transfer of property between 2 parties, witnessed by a list of individuals whose names are recorded on the tablet. The vocabulary includes terms that appear to relate to land, boundaries, ownership, and contractual obligation, terms that are largely unknown from other Etruscan texts, and that therefore cannot be cross-referenced or confirmed. The interpretation of the Tabula Cortinensis has been the subject of extensive scholarly debate. The Italian epigrapher Luciano Agostiniani published the first comprehensive analysis in 2000, proposing readings for many of the text's terms based on contextual inference and comparison with the Sippus Perusinus, another Etruscan legal text that appears to deal with property boundaries. Agostiniani's readings were detailed and careful, but they were also acknowledged to be provisional, dependent on interpretive assumptions that could not be independently verified. The debate around the Tabula Cortinensis illustrates a characteristic feature of Etruscan scholarship: the gap between description and interpretation. The physical properties of the tablet, its material, its dimensions, its letter forms, its layout, can be described with precision. The textual properties, the sequence of signs, the word boundaries, the morphological structure, can be described with reasonable confidence. But the semantic content, what the text actually says, what property is being transferred, under what conditions, with what legal consequences, can only be guessed at. The descriptions are secure, the interpretations are tentative, and the gap between the two is the gap that defines the field, the discovery that would transform Etruscan studies, the discovery that scholars have been hoping for since the 18th century would be a substantial bilingual text, a document in both Etruscan and a known language, long enough and varied enough to provide a comprehensive key to Etruscan vocabulary and grammar. The Pergi tablets are a partial bilingual, short, thematically narrow, and imperfect in their correspondence. What the field needs is a full bilingual, a text of several hundred words or more, covering a range of topics, with a close and consistent correspondence between the Etruscan and the known language versions. The probability of such a discovery is low, but not negligible. The Etruscans were in sustained contact with Greek-speaking and Phoenician-speaking populations. They traded, negotiated, and occasionally fought with speakers of other languages. It is entirely possible that bilingual documents were produced. Treaties, commercial agreements, diplomatic correspondence that recorded the same content in Etruscan and in Greek or Phoenician. If such a document was inscribed on a durable medium, stone or bronze, and if it was buried under conditions that preserved it, sealed in a tomb, buried under a collapsed building, deposited in a sanctuary, it might still be in the ground, waiting to be found. The search for such a document has been ongoing for over 2 centuries. It has not been found, but the ground has not been exhausted. The archaeological landscape of Etruria is vast, and only a fraction of it has been systematically explored. New sites are identified regularly through aerial photography, satellite imaging, and ground-penetrating radar. New excavation campaigns are launched every year. The possibility of a transformative discovery remains alive, a possibility sustained not by optimism but by the simple statistical reality that the ground contains more than has been found so far. The ongoing excavation at the Etruscan sanctuary of Fanum Voltumnae, the great federal sanctuary of the Etruscan League, whose location was known from Roman sources, but which has never been securely identified archaeologically, represents one of the most promising avenues for future discovery. The sanctuary was, according to Roman accounts, the meeting place of the Etruscan League and the site of annual religious festivals. If it were found and excavated, it might yield inscriptions of a type not previously attested. Federal documents, treaty texts, religious prescriptions of an intercity rather than local character. Such inscriptions would provide new vocabulary, new grammatical constructions, and, if any were bilingual, new cross-references between Etruscan and known languages. Other promising avenues include the underwater archaeology of the Etruscan port cities, where shipwrecks and harbour deposits may have preserved inscribed objects under conditions of oxygen deprivation that would prevent the decay of organic materials. The recent discovery of Etruscan-era shipwrecks off the coast of France and Sardinia has demonstrated that Etruscan maritime trade was more extensive than previously believed, and that the seabed may contain inscribed objects, cargo, tags, ship names, commercial documents that would add to the known corpus. The study of the labyrinthus itself continues to produce new insights, as advanced imaging techniques, including multispectral photography and X-ray fluorescence mapping, reveal letters and words that are invisible to the naked eye, obscured by centuries of staining, folding, and contact with the mummy's resinous wrappings. Recent imaging studies have recovered previously unreadable portions of the text, adding new words and new passages to the known content. Each recovered passage is a small victory, a few more words extracted from a document that has been giving up its secrets, grudgingly, over the course of a century and a half. But the labyrinthus also illustrates the diminishing returns that characterize Etruscan studies at this stage. Each newly recovered passage adds to the corpus, but the new words are, by their nature, among the most difficult to interpret. They are the words that were most damaged, most obscured, most resistant to recovery, and their interpretation depends on the same limited toolkit that has been applied to every other Etruscan word: contextual inference, combinatorial analysis, and comparison with the Purgi tablets and other bilingual fragments. The toolkit is adequate for some words and inadequate for others. The words that can be interpreted are interpreted. The words that cannot are catalogued, described, and left for future scholars, or for future discoveries to illuminate. Until that discovery is made, if it is ever made, Etruscan will remain what it is: a language that can be read but not understood, a language that speaks in sounds and is silent in meaning, a language that is closer to comprehension than any other undeciphered language in the world, and yet remains, in its most important dimensions, as opaque as the day its last speaker drew their final breath. There is a particular kind of frustration that Etruscan scholars experience that scholars of truly undeciphered scripts do not. The scholar of Linear A knows that they cannot read the text. The scholar of the Indus Valley script knows that they cannot read the signs. These scholars are locked of a building and they know it. They can see the door. They know it is closed. They accept the closure and work around it. The Etruscan scholar is not locked out. The Etruscan scholar is inside the building, inside the room where the texts are written, able to see the inscriptions on the walls, able to read every letter, able to pronounce every word. And they still cannot understand what they are reading. It is as though you were standing in a library, holding a book, reading it aloud with perfect pronunciation, and understanding nothing. The experience is not one of exclusion. It is one of immersion without comprehension, a sustained, intimate, maddening contact with a language that gives everything except the one thing that matters: meaning. Let that sink in. The deeper truth of the Etruscan language is not about linguistics. It is about the nature of understanding itself. We assume that reading is understanding, that the act of converting marks on a surface into sounds in the mind is the same as the act of grasping meaning. For most languages, this assumption holds. If you can read French, you can understand French. If you can read Chinese, you can understand Chinese. The connection between reading and understanding is so deeply embedded in our experience of literacy that we rarely question it. Etruscan breaks the connection. It demonstrates that reading and understanding are, in fact, two separate cognitive acts, acts that normally occur together, but that can be dissociated. You can read without understanding. You can pronounce without comprehending. You can hold a text in your hands, speak its words aloud, and be no closer to its meaning than if the page were blank. The Etruscan language is the proof that literacy is not the same as comprehension, that the ability to decode symbols into sounds is necessary but not sufficient for the recovery of meaning. This dissociation has implications that reach far beyond the specific case of Etruscan. In the modern world, we are surrounded by texts that we can read but do not understand. Legal contracts, tax codes, medical research papers, software documentation. The experience of reading without understanding is, for most people, a daily occurrence. A routine encounter with language that is technically legible but practically incomprehensible. The Etruscan scholar experiences this dissociation in its most extreme form. A complete language, 13,000 inscriptions, a well-understood alphabet, and an understanding that barely scratches the surface of the content. The philosopher Hans-Georg Gadamer wrote about the concept of the hermeneutical circle. The idea that understanding a text requires understanding the context, but understanding the context requires understanding the text. For most ancient languages, the hermeneutical circle is not vicious. It can be entered through comparison with related languages, through bilingual texts, or through the gradual accumulation of contextual knowledge. For Etruscan, the circle is viciously closed. The text cannot be fully understood without the context. The context cannot be fully reconstructed without the text, and neither text nor context provides a point of entry that would allow the circle to be broken. The Etruscan hermeneutical circle is the deepest and most intractable version of a problem that affects, to varying degrees, every ancient language. But other ancient languages have escape routes, comparative data, bilingual texts, descendant languages, that allow the scholar to step outside the circle and approach the text from an independent direction. Etruscan has no escape route. The scholar is trapped inside the circle, able to see every wall but unable to find a door. The sounds are audible, the grammar is visible, the meaning is locked away, not behind an impenetrable wall, but behind a wall that is thin, translucent, and absolutely unbreakable. The philosopher Michael Polanyi's concept of tacit knowledge, knowledge that we possess and use but cannot fully articulate, provides an illuminating parallel. Polanyi argued that much of what we know is embodied in practices and habits that resist explicit formulation. The Etruscan language, as a living system, was a form of tacit knowledge, a system of rules, associations, and meanings that its speakers possessed and used fluently, but that they never fully articulated in any surviving document. The grammar of Etruscan, the rules that governed how words were combined, how meanings were expressed, how ideas were structured, was not written down in any Etruscan grammar book. It was implicit in the speech of the Etruscan community, carried in the minds and habits of millions of speakers, and transmitted from generation to generation through the ordinary process of language acquisition. When the community died, when the last speaker drew their last breath, the tacit knowledge of Etruscan grammar died with them. The surviving inscriptions are the external traces of this tacit knowledge, the products of a linguistic system whose rules we can partially infer but cannot fully reconstruct. The inscriptions show us what the Etruscans wrote. They do not show us what the Etruscans knew about their own language, the intuitive understanding of grammar, semantics, and pragmatics that every native speaker possesses and that no inscription can fully encode. The gap between the inscriptions and the language they represent is the gap between a footprint and a foot, between a shadow and a body, between a trace and the thing that made it. The traces survive. The thing itself is gone. This is the deepest and most irreducible dimension of the Etruscan problem. It is not a problem of insufficient data, though the data is insufficient. It is not a problem of inadequate methods, though the methods are limited. It is a problem of the nature of language itself, of the fact that language is a living system, sustained by a living community, and that when the community dies, the system dies, leaving behind only traces that are, by their nature, incomplete representations of the whole. And it gets stranger, because the Etruscan problem is not static, it is asymptotic. The more we learn, the more slowly we learn. The easy gains, the funerary formulae, the personal names, the kinship terms, the divine names from the mirrors were made decades ago. The recent gains have been smaller, harder won, and more uncertain. Each new word added to the known vocabulary costs more effort than the last. Each new grammatical insight requires more data and produces less certainty. The curve of understanding is flattening, approaching a horizontal asymptote that represents the maximum comprehension achievable from the available evidence. The mathematician in the room recognizes this pattern. It is the curve of diminishing returns, the pattern observed whenever a finite body of data is mined for information. The early extractions are rich, the later extractions are lean. Eventually, the data is exhausted. All the information it contains has been extracted, and further effort produces no additional return. The Etruscan corpus may be approaching this point. The combinatorial method has been applied to every word in the corpus. The Purgi tablets have been analysed by every qualified scholar. The Liber Linteus has been studied, transcribed, indexed, and subjected to every known form of linguistic analysis. The returns are diminishing, the asymptote is near. This is not science fiction. This is the actual trajectory of Etruscan studies. The field is not stagnating through lack of effort. It is stagnating through exhaustion of data. The scholars are as talented and as dedicated as ever. The methods are more powerful than ever. But the data, the inscriptions, the texts, the bilingual fragments, is finite, and it may have yielded most of what it has to give. The experience of approaching the asymptote is shared, to some degree, by every scholar who has worked intensively on Etruscan for an extended period. The initial years of engagement are exciting. The scholar learns the alphabet, discovers the onomastic system, grasps the basic morphology, and begins to pass simple inscriptions. The intermediate years are productive. The scholar deepens their knowledge of the vocabulary, refines their understanding of the grammar, and begins to contribute new interpretations of specific texts. The later years are frustrating. The scholar encounters the same walls that every previous scholar has encountered, the same ambiguities that resist resolution, the same words that refuse to yield their meanings. The trajectory is personal, but it mirrors the trajectory of the field as a whole. Rapid early progress, gradual deceleration, and eventual convergence on a limit that cannot be exceeded without new evidence. The scholar Rex Wallace of the University of Massachusetts Amherst, who maintains one of the most comprehensive databases of Etruscan inscriptions, has described the state of the field with a directness that captures both the achievement and the frustration. "We have come a long way," Wallace has observed. 200 years ago, we could read Etruscan letters but could not identify a single word. Today, we can identify roughly 1,000 words and can parse the grammar of simple sentences. That is genuine progress. But the distance between where we are and where we need to be, full comprehension of extended prose, is vast, and the rate of progress is slowing. Each new word costs more effort than the last. Each new grammatical insight requires more data. The curve is flattening. Unless something changes, unless a major new discovery injects fresh data into the system, the curve will continue to flatten and full comprehension will remain out of reach. Wallace's assessment is not pessimistic, it is realistic, and the realism, applied to a problem that has consumed the careers of some of the finest linguists and epigraphers of the past 2 centuries, is itself a kind of achievement, an honest reckoning with the limits of what human scholarship can accomplish when the evidence is finite and the language stands alone. The only way to break the asymptote is to add new data, to find new inscriptions, new texts, new bilinguals that would inject fresh information into a system that is running dry. This is why every Etruscan scholar, however focused on linguistic analysis, keeps one eye on the archaeological literature, watching for reports of new discoveries, hoping for the inscription that will crack open a new domain of vocabulary, the bilingual that will confirm or refute decades of tentative interpretation, the long text that will finally provide the sustained prose that the combinatorial method needs to deliver definitive results. The hope is not irrational. The ground of Etruria still yields surprises. The Tabula Cortinensis was found in 1992. The Purgi tablets were found in 1964. The Liber Linteus was recognized as an Etruscan text only in the 19th century. Each discovery changed the field. Each discovery added something that had not been there before. The next discovery, the one that is still in the ground, might change it again. But the hope is also constrained by a sobering arithmetic. The Etruscan civilization flourished for over 700 years. During that time, it produced, on the evidence of Roman testimony, a substantial body of literature. Of that literature, nothing survives except the inscriptions on durable materials: stone, bronze, terracotta, gold, and the single miraculous linen book that was saved by the accident of Egyptian mummification. The literary works, the histories, the religious treatises, the legal codes, the philosophical reflections, are gone. They were written on linen, wood, and wax. They decomposed in the Italian climate. They were not preserved by any accident comparable to the Egyptian mummification of the Libelintius. They are gone, and they are not coming back. The gap between what the Etruscans wrote and what survives is the gap at the center of the Etruscan language problem. The surviving inscriptions are the residue of a literate civilization, the durable fraction of a textual output that was, in its totality, vastly larger and vastly more varied than what remains. The residue is enough to read. It is not enough to understand. And the missing material, the material that would make understanding possible, has been consumed by 2,500 years of Italian weather, Italian agriculture, and Italian history. The Roman testimony about the Etruscan literary tradition is tantalizing in its specificity. Cicero, in his treatise De Divinatione, describes the Etruscan disciplina, the body of religious and divinatory doctrine that the Romans regarded as the Etruscans' most distinctive intellectual achievement. The disciplina, according to Cicero, comprised 3 categories of sacred books: the Libri Haruspicini, which dealt with the examination of animal entrails for prophetic signs; the Libri Fulgurales, which dealt with the interpretation of lightning; and the Libri Rituales, which dealt with the rituals of city foundation, temple consecration, and public ceremony. Each category was a substantial body of text, not a single book, but a tradition of writings accumulated over centuries, refined by generations of priests and scholars, and consulted by both Etruscan and Roman religious authorities for guidance in matters of state and private life. The Disciplina was, by the standards of the ancient world, an extraordinary intellectual achievement, a systematic, comprehensive, and detailed body of religious knowledge that covered not just ritual practice, but cosmological theory. The Etruscans did not merely observe lightning and examine entrails. They developed theories about the nature of divine communication, about the structure of the cosmos, about the relationship between the observable world and the unseen forces that governed it. These theories were expressed in the sacred books and were taught in the religious schools that trained the haruspices and the augurs, who served both Etruscan and Roman communities. None of this survives. Not a page, not a sentence, not a word that can be confidently attributed to the Disciplina. The entire theoretical edifice, the cosmology, the theology, the divinatory system, is known only through Roman descriptions, which are external, partial, and filtered through Roman conceptual categories that may not accurately represent the Etruscan originals. What the Etruscans believed about the gods, about the cosmos, about the nature of fate and free will, the questions that lie at the heart of any civilization's intellectual life, is permanently inaccessible because the texts that express those beliefs are gone, and the language in which they were written cannot be fully understood. The Etruscans speak to us across the centuries. Their words are clear, their meanings are dark, and the darkness is not the darkness of an unlit room. It is the darkness of a room whose light has gone out, a room that was once bright, once full of meaning, once alive with the sounds of a language spoken by millions of people across one of the most culturally rich regions of the ancient Mediterranean. The light went out when the language died, and no amount of scholarship, however brilliant, can relight a lamp whose fuel is gone. The Etruscan case holds a unique lesson for the modern world, because the mechanism of its loss, linguistic assimilation, the voluntary adoption of a dominant language, is the same mechanism that is killing languages around the world today. The Etruscans did not lose their language through violence or catastrophe. They lost it through prosperity. They lost it because the dominant culture, Rome, offered something better, a language of wider communication, of greater political opportunity, of superior economic utility. The Etruscans chose Latin because Latin gave them access to a wider world, and the choice multiplied across generations, killed the Etruscan language as surely as any invading army could have. This pattern, the death of a language through the rational, voluntary choices of its speakers, is the predominant pattern of language death in the modern world. Languages are not, in most cases, forbidden or suppressed. They are abandoned, set aside by speakers who find that the dominant language serves their practical needs better. Each individual choice is rational. Each individual speaker who shifts from their heritage language to the dominant language gains something: wider communication, better employment prospects, greater social integration. But the aggregate effect of millions of rational individual choices is the death of the language, and with it, the permanent loss of the knowledge, the perspectives, and the expressive capabilities that the language uniquely carried. The Etruscan situation was, in this regard, a preview of the modern global condition. The spread of English, Mandarin, Spanish, and other dominant languages across the world is producing exactly the same pattern of linguistic replacement that Latin produced in ancient Italy. Smaller languages are being abandoned by their speakers in favor of larger ones. The replacement is voluntary, the consequences are irreversible, and the loss of vocabulary, of grammatical complexity, of unique ways of categorizing and expressing experience is permanent. The linguist Crystal has estimated that a language dies somewhere on Earth approximately every 2 weeks. Each death follows the Etruscan trajectory, a period of bilingualism, followed by a generational shift toward the dominant language, followed by the death of the last fluent speaker, followed by permanent silence. Each death eliminates not just a communication system, but a repository of knowledge, ecological, cultural, philosophical, that was encoded in the unique vocabulary and grammar of the dying language. The Etruscan language carried knowledge about Etruscan religion, Etruscan law, Etruscan medicine, and Etruscan philosophy that has been permanently lost. Each modern language that dies carries comparable knowledge about its speaker's relationship with the world. The Etruscan case is particularly instructive because it demonstrates the long-term consequences of linguistic loss. The Etruscans were not a primitive people whose language held only local significance. They were a major civilization, the founders of Italian urbanism, the teachers of Rome, the creators of a religious and artistic tradition that shaped the entire Mediterranean world. Their language was the vehicle of a cultural achievement of the first order, and it is gone, replaced by Latin, forgotten by Rome, and accessible to modern scholarship only in the halting, incomplete, frustrating form of 13,000 inscriptions that can be read but not understood. If a language of this stature can be lost, if the vehicle of a major civilization can be driven to extinction by the normal processes of cultural contact and economic incentive, then no language is safe. The Etruscan case demonstrates that linguistic death is not a fate reserved for marginal or isolated languages. It can happen to any language, anywhere, whenever a more powerful or more useful alternative becomes available. The Etruscans spoke a major language. They were absorbed by a more powerful culture, and their language died. The same could happen, is happening, to hundreds of languages around the world today. The difference between the Etruscan situation and the modern situation is one of awareness. The Etruscans did not know their language was dying. They did not have linguists documenting its decline, activists fighting for its preservation, or international organizations cataloguing its endangered status. They simply made choices, practical, individual, understandable choices, that, over generations, extinguished their language. We, by contrast, know exactly what is happening. We can watch languages die in real time. We can count the speakers, measure the decline, and predict the date of extinction with statistical precision. We know, with a clarity that the Etruscans never had, that the process is happening, and that it is irreversible once it reaches a critical point. The question is whether our knowledge will make any difference. The question is whether we will use our awareness to intervene, to support endangered languages, to fund documentation efforts, to create conditions under which speakers of minority languages can maintain their heritage without sacrificing their economic opportunities. The Etruscan case suggests that the odds are not in our favor. The economic incentives that drive linguistic replacement are powerful, persistent, and, from the perspective of individual speakers, entirely rational. Fighting them requires not just awareness, but resources, institutional support, and a cultural commitment to linguistic diversity that most societies have not demonstrated. The Etruscans did not make a decision to let their language die. They made a million small decisions, each one reasonable, each one understandable, each one a tiny step toward the same destination. And the destination, when they arrived at it, sometime in the 1st or 2nd century of the Common Era, when the last Etruscan speaker drew their last breath, was silence. Not the silence of destruction, the silence of exhaustion, the silence of a language that had been spoken for 700 years, and that simply quietly, finally stopped. What does it mean for a civilization to speak and be heard but not understood? The Etruscan case is unique among the world's partially or fully lost languages because the Etruscans are not silent. They are audible. Their inscriptions can be read aloud with confidence. Their alphabet is transparent. Their phonology is well established. A scholar can stand in the painted tombs of Tarquinia, read the inscriptions on the walls, and actually hear, in their own voice, the sounds that the Etruscans heard. The experience is unlike any other in the study of dead languages. It is an experience of proximity without comprehension, of closeness without contact. The journey of this story has taken us from the founding of the first complex civilization in Italy, through the slow death of its language, under the weight of Roman assimilation, through 2 centuries of scholarly effort, and to the recognition that the Etruscan language may never be fully understood. Not because it is inaccessible, but because the specific evidence that would make it accessible has been destroyed. The connection between the opening of this story and this moment is the connection between sound and silence, between the audibility of the Etruscan language and the opacity of its meaning. We began with the paradox, a language that can be read but not understood. We end with the recognition that the paradox may be permanent, that the gap between reading and understanding, which is normally closed by the comparative method and by extended bilingual evidence, may remain open for Etruscan because neither the comparative framework nor the bilingual evidence is sufficient to close it. Are we making the same mistakes? The question is perhaps less obviously applicable to the Etruscan case than to cases of violent destruction like Rongorongo or environmental destruction like the Olmec script. The Etruscan language was not destroyed by slavers or consumed by jungle. It was replaced, gradually, peacefully, through the normal processes of linguistic assimilation that occur whenever a dominant culture absorbs a subordinate one. The Romans did not suppress Etruscan. They simply offered Latin as a more useful alternative, the language of power, commerce, law, and opportunity. The Etruscans chose to adopt it. The choice was rational, individual, and voluntary. And the cumulative effect of millions of rational, individual, voluntary choices was the death of the Etruscan language and the permanent loss of its full meaning. This pattern, the voluntary adoption of a dominant language leading to the death of a subordinate language, is the most common mechanism of language death in the modern world. It is happening today on every continent at an accelerating rate. Indigenous languages are being replaced by national languages. Minority languages are being replaced by majority languages. Local languages are being replaced by global languages. In each case, the replacement is driven not by violence or coercion, but by economic incentive, social pressure, and the practical advantages of speaking the dominant language. In each case, the replacement is voluntary, at least at the level of individual choice, if not at the level of structural forces. And in each case, the result is the same. A language dies, and with it dies a body of knowledge, a way of seeing the world, and a tradition of expression that cannot be recovered. The Etruscans were among the first victims of this process in the Western world. They may also be the most eloquent, because they left behind a record that is large enough to tantalize, clear enough to pronounce, and opaque enough to ensure that the full depth of their civilization will remain forever beyond our reach. The Etruscan language is not a locked room. It is a room with one-way glass. We can see in, we can hear in, we can identify shapes, recognize patterns, and make out the outlines of meaning. But we cannot enter. We cannot touch. We cannot fully apprehend what is on the other side. The glass is there, thin, transparent, impassable. and the Etruscans on the other side of the glass continue to speak. In a language we can hear but cannot understand, in words we can read but cannot translate, in a voice that is as clear as any in the ancient world and as dark as the tombs in which their words are written. The Etruscan case also illuminates, with particular clarity, the relationship between language and identity. The Etruscans are known to us primarily through their material culture, their art, their architecture, their tombs, their technology. This material culture is rich, distinctive, and well documented. We can describe in detail how the Etruscans built, how they painted, how they sculpted, how they engineered. We can reconstruct their trade networks, their agricultural practices, their settlement patterns, and their demographic trajectories. We can, in short, reconstruct the external dimensions of Etruscan civilization, the dimensions that leave material traces. What we cannot reconstruct is the internal dimension, the dimension of thought, belief, feeling, and expression that makes a civilization more than a collection of objects. The internal dimension is carried by language. It is expressed in words. It is encoded in the vocabulary, the grammar, and the idioms that a people develop over centuries to describe their experience of the world. When the language is fully understood, the internal dimension is accessible. We can read the thoughts of the ancient Egyptians, the prayers of the ancient Greeks, the laws of the ancient Romans, because we can read their languages. When the language is only partially understood, the internal dimension is only partially accessible. And the Etruscan case demonstrates that partial access can be more frustrating than no access at all, because it reveals enough to show what is missing without providing enough to fill the gap. The Etruscan civilization is, in consequence, a civilization that is externally rich and internally impoverished, magnificently documented in its material achievements and almost entirely undocumented in its intellectual and spiritual life. We know how the Etruscans lived. We do not know what they thought about living. We know how they buried their dead. We do not know what they believed about death. We know what their gods looked like. We do not know what their gods meant. The material record is a body. The linguistic record is a shadow. And a body without a shadow is as uncanny as a shadow without a body. Present but incomplete, visible but not fully real. The question of whether Etruscan will ever be fully understood is ultimately a question about the future of archaeology. The language cannot be deciphered from the existing evidence. This is not a controversial statement. It is the consensus of the field, a consensus reached reluctantly over decades by scholars who have devoted their careers to the attempt. The only path to full understanding runs through new evidence, evidence that might emerge from future excavations, from the analysis of previously neglected artifacts, or from the development of new analytical techniques that can extract more information from the existing corpus. The most important contribution that the modern world could make to the understanding of Etruscan would be not a new analytical method, but a new inscription, a long text, ideally bilingual, found in a secure archaeological context, covering a topic that provides rich vocabulary and grammatical variety. Such a text would transform the field overnight. It would provide the sustained prose that the combinatorial method needs. It would supply the bilingual cross-references that the comparative method needs. It would fill the gap between reading and understanding that has defined Etruscan studies for 2 centuries. The probability of finding such a text is unknown but not negligible. The archaeological landscape of Etruria is far from exhausted. Thousands of known sites remain unexcavated. Thousands more are undoubtedly still undiscovered. The soil of Tuscany, Umbria, and Lazio has been yielding Etruscan artifacts for centuries and shows no sign of stopping. The next major discovery could come tomorrow, or it could come in a century, or it could come never. The Etruscans, who gave so much to the civilization that succeeded them, wait with the patience of the dead for the living to decipher their words. They have been waiting for 2,500 years. The tombs are quiet. The painted banqueters continue their eternal feast. The inscriptions on the walls continue to speak. And the scholars, generation after generation, continue to listen, hearing the sounds, parsing the grammar, tabulating the frequencies, and hoping that someday, somehow, the sounds will resolve into sense, and the words that have been read for 2 centuries will finally be understood. In the underground tombs of Tarquinia, there are paintings that have survived for over 2,500 years. They depict men and women reclining at banquets, their faces turned toward each other in attitudes of conversation, their hands raised in gestures of speech and toast and laughter. They are talking. They are speaking to each other in a language that was as natural to them as breathing, in words that flowed as easily as the wine that fills their painted cups. The banqueters are frozen in the act of communication, caught mid-sentence, mid-thought, mid-word for 25 centuries and counting. The words they spoke are gone. The sounds that filled the painted rooms, the laughter, the arguments, the songs, the whispered confidences, dissipated the moment they were uttered. What survives is the image of speech without the substance of speech, the picture of people talking without any record of what they said. And this is the final irony of the Etruscan language. We have their words, we have 13,000 inscriptions, we have texts on stone and bronze and gold and linen. We have more Etruscan texts than most scholars could read in a lifetime. And the words, however numerous, however legible, however carefully preserved, are not enough. They are the shadows of speech, the visible traces of a linguistic tradition that was once as rich, as complex, and as expressive as Latin or Greek, but that has been reduced, by the death of the language and the loss of its literature, to a collection of readable but largely incomprehensible fragments. The answer to the title question, was Etruscan what we thought it was, is this: it was more. It was not the primitive, marginal, easily dismissed language that early scholars assumed. It was the vehicle of a major civilization, a civilization that shaped the foundations of Roman culture, that produced art and engineering and religion of extraordinary sophistication, and that maintained a literate tradition for over 700 years. It was a language that expressed thoughts, recorded laws, prescribed rituals, narrated histories, and sustained the inner life of millions of people across centuries of Mediterranean history. It was, in every meaningful sense, one of the great languages of the ancient world, and it is the only great language of the ancient world that we can read but cannot understand. The comparative method, the most powerful tool in the historical linguist's arsenal, cannot help because Etruscan has no relatives. The bilingual method, the second most powerful tool, can help only marginally because the available bilinguals are short, narrow, and imperfect. The combinatorial method, the third most powerful tool, has been applied exhaustively and has reached the limits of what the available data can support. Every tool has been tried. Every tool has produced partial results. No tool has produced full comprehension. The Etruscan language is the most approachable of all the ancient world's linguistic mysteries, and, for precisely that reason, the most frustrating. A language that cannot be read at all can be set aside, filed under impossible, and left for future generations. A language that can be almost understood cannot be set aside. It beckons. It tantalizes. It offers just enough to keep the scholar working, and just too little to reward the work with certainty. It is the ancient world's most elegant trap, a puzzle that seems always on the verge of solution, and that never quite arrives. In the Museo Nazionale Etrusco in Rome, there is a gold fibula, a brooch, inscribed with one of the oldest Etruscan texts known. The inscription reads, in transliteration, Mi mamas venelisinai numasiana thahvana lathiali ulpayasi. The words can be read. The first word me means I or I am. The second word is a personal name. The remaining words include what appear to be a family name, a patronymic, and one or more terms whose meanings are uncertain. Me, I am. Those two syllables are in a sense the entire Etruscan language speaking at once. The Etruscans are saying, I am, I exist, I was here, I made this, I wrote this, read me. We are reading them. We have been reading them for 200 years, and we still cannot fully hear what they are saying. The voice is there, clear, patient, insistent. The meaning is just out of reach, separated from us not by the wall of an undeciphered script, but by the thinner, more treacherous barrier of a language that has no family, no descendants, and no key. The painted banqueters in the tombs of Tarquinia continue their conversation. The inscriptions on the walls continue to speak. The golden fibula continues to say, me, I am. And the scholars, generation after generation, continue to listen, to analyze, to interpret, and to hope knowing that the language may never yield its full secret, and knowing that the attempt to understand is, in itself, a form of respect for the people who spoke it and the civilization that sustained it. The sounds endure, the meanings fade, and the Etruscans, who gave Rome its name, its gods, its archers, and its augurs, speak from their tombs in a voice that the whole world can hear and no one can fully comprehend. The words are clear, the understanding is not. The scholar Larissa Bonfanti, who devoted her career to Etruscan studies and who co-authored the standard reference work on the Etruscan language, described her relationship with the language in terms that speak for every Etruscanist who has ever lived. "I have spent my life with these people," Bonfant said. "I know their names, I know their families, I know their gods, I know their art, I know the sounds of their language as intimately as I know the sounds of my own. And I cannot understand what they are saying. I can read their words, I cannot hear their thoughts. The distance between reading and hearing is the distance I have spent my life trying to cross. I have not crossed it. I do not think it can be crossed." Bonfanti's words are not a confession of failure, they are a testament to the nature of the problem. The distance she describes is not a distance of effort or intelligence, it is a distance of evidence, the distance between what the surviving inscriptions provide and what full understanding requires. The inscriptions provide sounds, full understanding requires meaning, and meaning, for a language without relatives and without a substantial bilingual corpus, cannot be recovered from sounds alone. The Etruscans remain, after 25 centuries, the most articulate of the ancient world's silent civilizations. They have words, they have inscriptions, they have an alphabet that any scholar can read. They speak louder than the Minoans, louder than the Indus Valley people, louder than the builders of the Phaistos disc, and they are, for all their volume, no better understood, because volume without clarity is noise, and clarity without comprehensions is in the end the cruelest form of silence. And the distance between clarity and understanding, the small, unbridgeable distance between reading a word and knowing what it means, is, for the Etruscans, eternal.